Good morning, everybody. I'm Nicole Hennessy. I'm Vice President of Music Business Association. Welcome to the Music Biz Passport. This is a new series that we started just this year. It came to us as it's something that we've wanted to do is have more conversations about the global music business and bring partners together to learn from each other and possibly even connect to do business. This was a concept that we had, well before the pandemic, and of course, with travel, we couldn't do that. And then we decided to make it a virtual series to get things off the ground. And we've had some great conversations throughout 2024. We've talked about Afro beats and Wana and, many, many other topics. And I'm just so thankful for the support that the music business community has given to this series. I thank all of the past presenters and attendees. And I think today we're definitely in store for a really wonderful presentation. But before we get directly into, lessons from abroad, let me just talk a little bit about Music Biz 2025. Tomorrow is our deadline for our call for presentations. Our program is crowdsourced. We give the industry a chance to submit topics, panel ideas, presentation ideas, and have a chance to be on the agenda, the educational program for the annual conference. Check out musicbiz2025.com for more information. As I said, that deadline is tomorrow. Great presentations coming in so far. Would love your ideas on what you would like to present at the conference. The conference, I should have told you that first, is this year in Atlanta, May 12th through the 15th. So if you are heading to Music Biz 2025 and have a great idea, visit musicbiz2025.com and look for the call for presentations and submit your presentation idea by tomorrow. December 4th is our deadline. Registration, hotel, all of that can also be booked at musicbiz2025.com as well. Starting today's presentation, you have two boxes on your screen. Many of you have already found the chat box and are introducing yourselves. Please do that there. Introduce yourself to other attendees that are here and have some conversations there. The Q&A box is for you to put questions for our presenters. They have a really packed agenda for you today. If they get to answer your questions, that's where they're going to look for them, in that Q&A box. So put your questions for our presenters there. So without further ado, we are here for Lessons from Abroad. I thank Music Canada, Reagan and the team there for putting together, organizing such a wonderful presentation. We're going to dive into some things that are happening in Canada and France and other parts of the world. We're going to talk about, the challenges that lie ahead for these countries, and, what the governments are thinking and what they're trying to do with these new strategies, and, what are the potential ripple effects for folks in those countries and beyond, and what lessons can we learn, in other parts of the country. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Monica Song, who's going to lead our conversation. She's going to then, introduce Graham, Alexander, and Patrick to you guys. So thank you to our esteemed panel today. I appreciate you being here and sharing your time and your expertise with all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. My name is Monica Song. I'm a partner at the law firm of Dentons Canada, LLP, and I'm delighted to be with you all today for today's presentation, Lessons from Abroad, What the Move to Regulate Streaming Services Means for the Music Industry. Governments everywhere are consulting their populations and launching initiatives on a nearly monthly basis to regulate different aspects of the internet. Audio streaming has largely been unregulated across the globe until recently. Beginning in the early part of 2024, France moved to impose a 1.2% levy on French audio streaming operators with sales in France in excess of 20 million euros. Canada has moved to require the registration of online audio streaming undertakings, and more recently and controversially, has moved to impose a 5% levy on revenues derived from streaming for all online undertakings not affiliated with a licensed undertaking with annual revenues in excess of 25 million Canadian. What are the potential ripple effects of audio levies in Canada and abroad? What are the government's policy objectives in imposing these types of obligations? And are there ways in which industry and regulators can chart a more efficient path forward? With me today to shed light on these questions are an esteemed panel of experts. Graham Davies from DIMA, Alexander Lash from SNAP in France, and Patrick Rogers from Music Canada. I'm going to introduce each of these panelists to you and then invite them to each say a few words about the work of their organizations. Graham Davies is president and CEO of the Digital Media Association. He is an experienced executive with a deep understanding of the music industry. Among the achievements that he has listed as being those that he's most proud of are his contributions and instrumentality in the UK's DCMS Select Committee inquiry into the economics of streaming. He was also instrumental in establishing the Credits Due campaign, along with Bjorn Ulvaeus of ABBA fame. And when he was CEO of the Ivors Academy, he established the Ivors as a preeminent songwriting award. So clearly, Graham has music in his blood and something that he's very passionate about. Graham, can you tell us a little bit about the work of DIMA on today's topic or otherwise?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Nicole, and everyone for this. Really, it's a valuable opportunity to talk about these things, which are really important. But yeah, in terms of my background, as you say, I've spent a lot of my time has been in music publishing. So, as you say, for 5 years, I was leading the Ivors Academy, which is a trade association representing the interests of songwriters in the UK, as well as doing the best songwriting awards in the world. I'm still slightly biased on that front. And then prior to that, I worked for many years at PRS for Music, which is the collecting society for performing mechanical rights in the UK, but also it took a very sort of a leadership role in terms of multi-territory licensing of online in Europe. So that was very much my background prior to now 1 year. I think it's 1 year and about 2 weeks here now based in Washington, DC, as president and CEO of the Digital Media Association. Our organization has been going for over 25 years, and its membership has changed during that time, but currently we represent the leading music streaming companies, so that being Apple, Amazon, Spotify, Feed FM, Pandora, service in the US, and YouTube. So we represent the interests of our members, specifically as they relate to music streaming. As an organization, I think historically have been very US focused. A lot of time and attention was spent in terms of modernization of music industry here in the US. The Music Modernization Act was a key focus, but over the past year, we've started to now represent issues more broadly. So we have been very active in Canada, which we're going to talk about today, and are starting to also represent in some other territories as well. So this kind of more broader global perspective is something which very much connects with us.
Thanks very much, Graham. Next, Alexander Lash is the Managing Director of the Syndicat National de l'Édition Phonographique, or SNAP, in France. Alexander is an intellectual property lawyer by training and a digital activities expert. He's been with SNAP since 2009, has been in the Managing Director role since 2018. And prior to joining SNAP, he was with the Société des auteurs, compositeurs, éditeurs de musique in France between 2004 and 2009. Alexandre, welcome. And can you tell us a few things about your work with SNAP?
Yeah, thank you, Monica, and thank you for having me today. Actually, SNAP is the French equivalent of Music Canada. So we represent the interest of the French phonographic industry, dealing with the public authorities at national and European level, but we are also in charge of the official charts, certification awards, market figures, all sort of tools for the industry.
Thank you, Alexandre. And last but not least is Patrick Rogers, CEO of Music Canada. He's joining us from my home jurisdiction of Canada. So Patrick is a mover and a shaker in the music industry in Canada when he's not at the Junos discussing the importance of human artistry. He's wearing his other hat, which is to deal with somewhat less creatives in government at all levels in Canada. Prior to joining Music Canada in 2016, Patrick was on Parliament Hill, active in federal politics, serving in the Prime Minister's office, as well as a Director of Policy for the Canadian Minister of Canadian Heritage. So Patrick, can you tell us a few words about the work of Music Canada?
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica, and thanks for doing this. Look, Music Canada is the trade association for Canada's major labels. We have each major label has Canadians working on Canadian music for the Canadian market and the world. We think we're a huge cultural success story in that way. And they all have brand new buildings that we're all super proud of. Music Canada also runs the Gold Platinum program with the records behind me, which will soon be celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2025. We try to be as a trade association as our members are in the industry. And so that means looking out for the rest of the space and making sure that whether it's digital regulation or copyright law or the future of AI, that we're both looking out for the artists that our members work for, but also making sure that the industry can work and the government understands it.
Thanks so much, Patrick, Alexandre, and Graham. So let's dive into our discussion today by setting the stage and discussing a little bit about how we got to today. The genesis of streaming and the streaming revolution is all around us, but it's not been that long ago that audio and the consumption of audio happened in a very different way. And so let's talk a little bit about your perspectives on how the streaming business model differs from music publishing and distribution models that preceded it and what remains the same. And I thought that perhaps Graham could start us on this discussion. So Graham, what are your thoughts on what you have seen in the evolution of music?
Yeah, thanks. I think it is an important place to start. As you say, perhaps for younger people, they may not have known other forms of music distribution to streaming and social media and these kinds of things. But if I could, say the people on this call, on this panel, are old enough to remember the period prior to streaming. So, we're only looking at around 20 years roughly in terms of this digital transformation that's happened. And the shortcut message would be it's been an incredible success. We've got success for consumers having more access to music than would have been dreamt of prior to streaming. We've got enormous music revenues now, which I'll build on. And that's based on millions of consumers paying for music. Many are paying much more for music than they ever would have previously. It's a success for creators in terms of the international reach and opportunity that sits there with streaming. And where that then comes to, in terms of Patrick and Alexandre, in terms of monies and investment into the music industry, streaming is now generally in many territories sort of operating around 80% of recorded music revenue. So it's, a very important, that's where we are, but the journey that we've been on came from obviously the disruption. If we go back, it's to the Napster days of peer-to-peer file sharing. And you know, that was so disruptive. I was in the industry at that point. I was working for PRS and MCPS at the time. And, you know, the whole industry, and particularly the record labels that Patrick and Alexander are representing, you know, saw such a enormous impact of that in terms of the revenues. And I think, you know, very concerningly was that the consumer was starting to get used to accessing music content without payment for free, really brought forward piracy. You know, all industries, and music industry has always had piracy, and it probably will always have elements of piracy and bad actors. But actually, you know, it was becoming very mainstream for people to access music in that way. So really, that's an important backdrop to the journey that we've all been on. And when I say we, you know, it's Steam as members working with Patrick and Alexander's members in terms of building this streaming economy. And, you know, let's kind of see, well, what does that look like? I mean, in terms of volume, you know, the amount of recordings now that are being created has increased enormously. And I think this kind of digital transformation has liberated a lot more music to be created. There are obviously tensions around, you know, the quality of that, or, you know, the challenge that then creates for creators and artists to get that music heard within a lot more volume. But that is a benefit, you know, that actually more music is being created, we think, than ever before. And, you know, in terms of that consumer picture, we've been doing some research, and I think in terms of Canada, which I think is going to be a key focus for discussion today, 91% of music of consumers under 30 have a music streaming service. You know, that's amazing. And again, in this backdrop of the timescale that we're talking about for this to be established. We did a survey earlier this year. 86% of the respondents to that survey were positive, and actually very positive about their streaming subscription. So, you know, we've got consumers that really, really value it, and I think increasingly value their music streaming subscription. And then we've just done some research, I think this is hot off the press, that Canadian consumers prefer the ability to customize their listening experience by a ratio of 5:1 compared to radio. So I think that's also a very important piece here in terms of talking about the different business model, which was your question, Monica, is that, you know, streaming is actually very, very different to lots of the previous ways that people could consume music. It really has been quite revolutionary, I think, and we're still seeing that mature. And so it's obviously the backdrop in terms of this panel on regulation, and there's a lot of history of, particularly in Canada, of regulating broadcasting. You know, we've been at pains to kind of say, you know, music streaming is a very different business model. And so when you kind of look at what's available to the consumer, you know, the worldwide repertoire is available to the consumer, say, compared to what a radio station chooses to broadcast, or what a music store chose to stock in their store. And obviously in both cases, there's a limit as to how much a radio station can program and broadcast, and there's a limit to what a physical store can house. So I know this may be, you know, everyone knows this, but, you know, it's a very big factor here in that the streaming services are ingesting thousands of recordings a week, and that's going up and then being made available to the consumer. Obviously, the consumer then is put in charge in deciding, well, what do they want to listen to? Where is their interest? And that then gets, you know, informs algorithms, which then help with discovery to actually say, well, if you like this, you may like this as well. And then around that, what the streaming services are also doing is investing, as Patrick talked about, you know, his members are investing in their presence in Canada. So do our members. So they're investing in teams on the ground in Canada, or teams on the ground in France, where Alexander is, to actually ensure that the local music is being profiled and platformed, and because a core audience for that will be people in that territory. But clearly, what we've seen are many instances where whether it's Latin music or some of the sort of Punjabi music coming out of Canada, are actually finding audiences around the world. So I think that, this is only going to grow in terms of music being something which is co-created with people internationally, or, somebody can do it all themselves very locally, but many songs are co-created now, internationally. And then the audience for those can also be international. So I think a lot of the points I'm making are probably known in terms of the differences between streaming and previous ones. I mean, another point that I think is important to make is that from that consumer money that's paid across in streaming, if we were to compare it in Canada to a commercial radio station, streaming services are paying in roughly around 70% of that money collected from the consumer goes through over to the rights holders, Patrick Alexander's members and the publishing and the PROs and all the rest. A commercial radio station will be paying roughly 8% of that. So I think, again, it's important when we talk about regulation, we're very concerned that regulation needs to be very carefully thought about. And you really do have to understand the different business models that are in play so that you don't get unintended consequences to things which are actually now very, very important. These are really important to our members, but this industry is very important to Patrick and Alexander's members, very important to consumers, very important to artists. So that's where we have big concerns about the current sort of approach to regulation, which seems to be bringing old models and just kind of forcing them onto a very different industry that we've now created.
Thanks, Graham. A lot to unpack, and thanks for setting the stage. How about we get into the focus of some of our discussion this morning by turning to Patrick. Patrick, how did we get from the streaming revolution that consumers are obviously loving to a 5% levy in Canada on all audio streaming revenues?
I mean, that's the 5% question of the day, right? What I like to do is look back and go to this place. So Canada has for since the 50s has had these sort of walled garden approaches to cultural funding. So the airwaves being a public good, the television stations are licensed through the CRTC. Money is then taxed and levied from them in order to create Canadian content. But of course, creating Canadian content with nowhere for it to go doesn't make any sense. And so we then make them air the content, and then we levy their revenues. The same on the radio side. We're going to make you play Canadian content, but we are going to work with you to create Canadian content for that to occur. And these programs were all based on taxing and levying people's, on the AV side, it was taxing and levying people's home cable bills. And on the radio side, it was taxing revenue from radio stations. And the first time I had ever heard of this, I was a director of policy of the Ministry of Canadian Heritage, and somebody came up to me, an official who was in charge of one of these programs, and they said, did you know about this cord cutting thing? I'm not going to have any money if we don't have cable bills. So we should tax internet bills. And being on the political side of the street that I was on at the time, and I'm still on the time, I said, get away from me. We're not doing this. But eventually, with change of government, this idea that there was money sitting out there in the world to be pumped back into these programs sort of started to take shape. The other moment, though, that I would also highlight for people, which has become clearer and clearer, I think, is the moment in either 2014 or 2015 where the CRTC held a hearing with Netflix and asked for a bunch of information that they would normally get from a regulated Canadian company. And Netflix told them to pound sand. And a bunch of Canada's cultural elite went, oh my goodness, like we can't have this. We need to know. We've always known what people are watching. We need to know what people are watching. And these services need to be regulated in Canada. And so I think funding is channel one, and a desire to maintain and sustain Canada's regulatory system is channel two, and here we are.
Mhm. Okay. I'm going to throw in there, but we can pick it up later, Patrick, the conundrum of actually having Canadians listen to so-called Canadian content, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Alexandre, can you maybe feed into the discussion and talk a little bit about how the French process and thinking either aligned or differs from how we got to where we are in Canada?
Well, actually, I would begin by saying that streaming music is also a chance for us, because it enhances the power of the local scene. French performers have always been super successful in France, particularly thanks to the quota system for French songs on the radio. But this success is growing stronger, I would say, organically, with the development of the streaming market to the benefit of rap music, for instance, which is very present at the very top of the charts, but not only, also to the benefit of all local repertoire. Of the 100,000 most listened to tracks in France last year, nearly 2/3 were actually produced in France and or developed by French teams. And at the same time, we saw that the subscription penetration rate was still insufficient. For a long time, we saw this in a positive light, with considerable room for improvement. But today, we also have to admit that despite a growing market, we are not catching up. So the development of the market is late in France, and subscription penetration is half as high in France as it is in the United States, for example. So just when we needed support to develop the streaming market, the government came up with a dogmatic proposal, the so-called streaming tax. Dogmatic because the public authorities refused to see that this new model brought money back into the entire music value chain, just as Graham explained. So together with the DSPs, we energetically fought this proposal for over 2 years, because we knew that it would put a further brake on the development of the French market. But having failed to provide sufficient funding for a public institution, the Centre National de la Musique, that it had itself set up, the government finally installed this controversial tax last year.
So, Alexandre, thank you. It seems that perhaps Canadian policymakers should look to what is working in France to enable French artists to be consumed at significant levels in the absence of a formal quota system on streaming platforms. But so turning then from the discussion of where we came from to what appears to be on the horizon, or what is on the horizon now, and what the impact of that is likely to be on the economics of streaming, on what it is that labels and artists and digital streaming platforms are trying to do. First things first, Graham, let's talk about the Canadian levies. So in Canada, who is liable to pay this 5% levy, which the technical term for this levy is called the base contribution obligation? And who's liable to pay, and what are the consequences potentially for audiences and consumers?
Yeah, so you're right. We call it a tax because it's you know, something which is imposed, we would argue, by the government through the regulator onto, and it's paid for by the music streaming services whose revenues need to be above, as you had said earlier, above a certain threshold. So it's coming directly from the streaming services themselves, from their margin. So you know, as I said before, you know, the streaming service margin is roughly in the realms of 30%, which is incredibly low, actually. You know, if you compare it to the other distribution mechanisms in the industry. And so from that, you know, our members are investing in running the service. These are not cheap things to do with the volumes involved. Also investing in local teams to work with the music industry in Canada, running various programs and initiatives, which, as I say, sort of platform. And just as Alexander was saying, you know, really wanting to, we're all in it together. We want to grow the market. We want to grow penetration, and we want really, you know, as many subscribers as possible. So all of that marketing and investment is funded from that 30%. And importantly, any business does need to make a margin to continue to operate and continue to invest. So that's kind of where the money for this 5% comes from. Now, it's not just that. The services are now also having to fund the regulator. There's also a digital services tax, which is also a further levy imposed onto our members. And then, you know, we're inexorably coming, as you're leading us towards the CanCon conversation, which is, you know, an unknown for us at the moment as to if the regulator sought to impose the system from radio of Canadian content, CanCon regime. That is a very scary proposition for our members, not just in terms of what it could do to the consumer experience, which we have to all, you know, be very mindful of, but also just the costs and burdens and administration of all of that. And then further, you described, you know, this 5% is a base contribution. So what we don't know is what further contributions are also going to be required from our members. So at the moment, all of this, I think Patrick did a good job of kind of explaining how the government and what I suppose their objectives have been, is all pointed at DEMA's members of the streaming services specifically to carry all of this burden.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so thank you. So Graham's addressed the impact and the fact that the streaming services are directly caught by the base contribution levy in Canada. Patrick, what are your thoughts on how this levy payable by streaming services, how that could affect artists and the music industry in Canada?
Well, so I think on this, we can talk about the evolution of Music Canada's position on this, which was that we started off very sort of excited about the potential for this, right? The promise from the CRTC was a blank page approach, that we would take from the best of the radio system and apply it to this digital space. And that was something that really appealed to us. Again, it's Warner Music Canada, Universal Music Canada, Sony Music Entertainment Canada, and not North America North, because the radio system allowed for this program to exist. But since streaming, more people are listening to more music by more artists in more genres than ever in the history of time. And we think that's something to be celebrated. Now, I don't blame officials and others to see that success be something worth taxing, but we should at least start with it as a point of celebrating and understanding. Because it is up against now everything ever recorded. Your song is up against everything ever recorded from all time, from everywhere. It's no longer what just happens to be on a radio programmer's idea. It is now everyone's favorite song from ever is what you need to break through in order to be listened to on streaming. Your choice is the greatest songs ever. And, I think that's a huge piece of it. So when I think about that 5% not going to artists, not going to platforms to help break Canadian artists, not going to artist management teams and artists who want to work with the world's greatest labels in order to break globally and actually make a difference on the streaming services that we're taxing, and that it's going to Canadian radio outside of major markets. It is going to the sustainment of the system that already exists. We've already shared our publicly and elsewhere, but we are so disappointed in that because this program.
Patrick, can you
Yeah.
just spell out what you're, so I'm going to ask you a direct question so that you can spell out what you mean by who the money is going to. So we've established who's paying in Canada, right?
Mhm.
The streaming services. Who is the money going to? Who is benefiting from the monies collected from the 5% levy? Just so that everyone is clear on that.
Yeah, so as of right now, a big bulk of it is going to the Canadian radio system, up towards 40%. I'm not really sure a breakdown of every percentage is all that value to people, but I think the biggest point is it is not going to the sort of dream that we had, which is, something new, something exciting. We call this a once in a generation regulatory process. And unfortunately, my dad's my dad's generation is the one that's going to go towards is going to benefit from this radio process. I saw a question just pop up. Why is it going to the radio? I don't understand. Welcome. This is a big part of our conversation because I think we also Graham and I put out a statement together following a CRTC workshop. Radio and streaming are not the same. You listen to them both with your ears, but otherwise, it goes. Everything about the process is different. Whether it's how you pick the music, how the songs are selected, the sheer volume in which you have control as a listener and a user. So I just saw another comment. It's going to other programs. Yes. So up towards 40% is going to traditional radio. Some of it is going to Factor and Musique Action. Some of it is going to other sort of places of the traditional funding system. Again, what I think a big concern of ours is that the dream at the start of this was that they were going to build an extension onto the CRTC house in order to regulate and understand the streaming market. Instead, what we've seen is all of this policy and all this work be crammed into the existing CRTC. And we think that's a mistake.
Okay, thank you. I want to go back to the French tax, which is structured somewhat differently. And so I want the audience to hear about that. So the French tax has been implemented for slightly longer, about a year. And my understanding is that it is a tax that is paid directly by consumers. So Alexandre, can you just tell us a little bit about the differences in terms of who has to pay the tax or how it is collected? And then segue into telling us a little bit about what you can see, if you can see already, what the impact of this tax has been in France.
Well, the French tax, is also directly paid by DSPs, but it is being passed on to consumers and or to the music value chain, depending on the contracts, depending on the strategy from different DSPs. We can clearly see now how bad an idea this tax is, because the platforms have reduced their marketing investment in France as a reaction. Some have increased their tariff, just as I said, specifically to cover the additional costs associated this tax. And just as Graham said, also because some of them don't have any margin to cover this costs. All this makes it even more challenging for the market to develop. And paradoxically, the proceeds of this tax do not have the redistributive effect that the government was hoping for. It is not funding the radio system, it is funding a public establishment called Centre National de la Musique, and the support of this centre, of this public body for recorded music, falls far short of what the sectors actually bring in with the tax. So that's a big disappointment, but no surprise.
Well, okay, so what is the Centre National de la Musique in France? What does it do, and how effective is it at what it does?
Well, I would say that the original ambition of this public body is to support the development of our artists in France and abroad, and this is a noble goal. But at this stage, the way in which the establishment itself has defended its own interests, especially regarding its funding, is against those of our sectors, and that makes us wary about the effectiveness of this kind of public policy towards music. So I will spare you my sarcasm, but well, we can't see how effective it is so far.
Okay. All right. Maybe a look beyond Canada and France. Is this wave catching on, Graham? Are Canada and France outliers, or are other countries or jurisdictions following suit?
Yeah. And I think in a way, sort of reflecting on, you know, the different sort of elements that we've gone through here. So we talked about how technology has brought forward, you know, a new way of accessing music. You've got Patrick saying that from a Canadian perspective, there's oh, hold on, you know, that's disrupting the regulators' funding. It's disrupting the kind of the status quo, and we've seen that a bit in France as well. So people kind of, my sort of response to your question, it depends what the policy objective is, and there's many different ones at play. I think, you know, my past that you talked about was, say, in terms of the economics of streaming debate in the UK, was very much kind of driven from artists saying how much of streaming money is getting through to them, and you know, that was a very complex debate and continues. And so some artists are kind of saying, you know, we need to kind of tax the streaming services because we're not seeing enough of the money. You know, there's different things are thrown into, I think, the cases or the pressure for regulation. But I think a lot of them, my sort of experience thus far is that they are not really sophisticated in understanding the current models and what the current models are doing. And just as we kind of explained, you know, we need the consumer to be, you know, with us. And, you know, it's so sad to see the effect of this in France is directly not supporting what should be the primary objective, which is to kind of grow the streaming economy for the benefit of the artists and the rights holders and the consumers there. And then the fear, you know, in Canada is that with the margin, if you squeeze the margin, something has to happen. So, you know, the last thing our members want to do is kind of pull back the investments in countries, or, you know, as Alexander said, in certain cases, having to have that conversation with rights holders around how much money can kind of flow through is currently happening. So I think that we are seeing interest, you know, in broader territories. You know, one of the areas that DEMA is becoming more active is in Latin America, and so, you know, we're engaged in Brazil. We saw some moves in Uruguay, for instance, in this kind of space. So I think different countries are coming at it from different perspectives, whether it's kind of a French flavor or a Canadian flavor or an artist kind of perspective. But I think you know, from a DEMA perspective, we understand the policy objectives. If we were to return to Canada, we understand the intent, the desire, and we share it. You know, we want Canadian artists to do really well in future, to have opportunity, to have platforms, and to have support. And we're pumping in loads of the money to kind of fund that currently. So if that's an objective that is going to appear in other territories of the world, we're happy to engage in that, so long as that engagement really does talk about what are we all currently doing, what's working, as Patrick said. Let's approach it more blank sheet rather than grabbing something that I think in the case of Canada and France, we would start to say, we're getting some evidence that doing that doesn't work. So let's not do that.
I thank you, Graham, for raising the topic of policy objectives. This familiar territory for me, and I think that's probably familiar territory for our panelists who, based on your backgrounds, you've all sat on, you know, the other side of the table in your past. I think it's always helpful when we're talking about government regulation to try to understand, you know, the perspective that the policymaker is coming from. And oftentimes that can be distilled into, well, what are the policy objectives? Or what are the problems that the regulatory bodies, authorities are trying to solve with the use of these taxes or levies? I'd like to hear quickly, although this could be an entire week's worth of symposiums and talks. I'd like to hear your perspectives on whether you think that these problems that perhaps the governments are trying to solve with the use of these levies, are these problems not legitimate? Or is it the case that you know, you can agree with the objectives, but that the way the government is going about trying to solve it is perhaps not ideal. So just letting you know, we only have 12 minutes left. And as I say, that this is a big question. I do also see a question from the audience about the criticality of discoverability of Francophone music in Canada, and that from the perspective of a Francophone user or audience, you know, discoverability is a huge issue. So I'm going to throw it out there, but try to keep your remarks brief, because I do want to allow for closing remarks. So perhaps just a couple of minutes each, please, on this larger question of what are the policy objectives, and is there a better way to achieve them?
I'll jump in. You know, I think when we set out, we were looking for a system that would allow up-and-coming Canadian talent to work with the best people in the world and have a regulatory system that reflects that. A good day at our labels is a day in which we are pitching the latest talent from St. John's and Timmins to talent, you know, to platform folks here on the ground in Canada, so that we can go to our people around the world and say, we have found the next star, and so that they can go to their people around the world and say, you know, Universal and Warner and Sony have the next stars for the streaming generation. If those people, if those platform folks aren't on the ground and have been replaced by regulatory staff, we've lost, and that means that's bad policy. And I think that's a huge concern for us. I think just quickly on the question of discoverability, you know, I think this is a bit of like a AV versus audio situation, that there are a lot of questions that I'm not paid to answer on the audio side about AV discoverability in the Francophone community. And I think, but I don't think we should let those issues flow over into the audio discussion, where so many of the platforms have universality of access to content. And I think what we've seen, you know, whether it's our Will Page report or whether it's other sources, that the ability to get your music out in French to French audiences, whether they be in Quebec or around the world, is now higher than it has ever been before. The gatekeepers that prevented that in the past in Quebec and elsewhere have been replaced now by audiences that want the music. And so where that music is wanted, that music is listened to and is available. And I think we're excited about that.
Okay, what about you, Alexandre? How do you have a better way of achieving the policy objectives of the French regulator?
Well, as I said, the goal with this tax was to fund a public body, and the aim of this public body is once again noble. It is helping the whole music value chain in doing what we do. So nothing could be against that, and that's part of the cultural exception, if I may say so, helping the cultural industries in funding them. But at the same time, to do so, we see that it's not working, because to fund the industry and the performers, we tax them. So it's kind of a loop, and it doesn't work. So we had other proposal to fund to fund this public body, including by contributing ourselves voluntarily. And it was okay for most of us. I mean, for DSPs and for CMOs, and well, we could have dealt with this differently in a more how do you say, with a better preparation to see where we are going, and to ensure everyone that it is fair and equitably split it between everyone. And well, this is not the case, because as I said, the way the tax is passed on to consumers or to the different stakeholders is not clear with this system, and at the end it has negative effect on competition, on several things. So there was also, I believe, another goal for the French government, that was to fix an issue with the CJEU decision about rap music with 2A, not about the repertoire, but an Irish society, if I'm not mistaken. And the consequence of that decision from the Court of Justice of the European Union was that French music CMOs has not the same level of money to help the right holders. And as a consequence, the government tried to better fund the Centre National de la Musique to supplement the CMOs. But once again, it's not working, because to fund us, they tax us. So basically, it's a loop.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Graham, on the same question, just quickly, is there a better solution to achieving the policy objectives, which arguably is to ensure that audiences in our countries, Canada, France, continue to listen to the creation of local artists?
Yeah, and so I think it does go back to, what's the problem we're trying to fix? So if I was to look, Alexandre gave some great statistics in terms of how French rap music is leading the charts in France, and streaming is helping power that. If we look to Canada, we can see that Canada is a net export country in terms of Canadian music. What's the problem? I can see some concerns and some problems popping up. Are artists getting enough? And as I say, we can dig into those issues and we can talk about them, but what is the problem that the regulator is trying to fix? If it's to fill a hole of money in their exchequer, well, they could be overt. They could go to the public and say, we're going to fund this through taxation because we believe in these institutions. Well, you go do that, but don't tax the consumer ultimately. Why should a Canadian music streaming consumer fund local news organizations in Canada. It makes no sense. And I think that you can hear from my colleagues that the money ends up going into weird places, and it's really not kind of making the difference that we all want. I think we're very aligned in terms of the objective. We want great music from around the world, in whichever country, to thrive. Consumers want that. It's a great ecosystem. We're funding as much as the services can into the industry to support initiatives of doing. You know, a minute, I would say this, but I'm slightly at odds as to what is the gap. And that's what we've kind of asked the Canadian government and the regulator. Please can we sit down and understand what's the gap that, as you see it, in terms of the current system, and what could we do? Rather, the conversation seems to have just flipped to, let's just impose broadcast regulation because we know how to do that. And that's kind of, it seems to be operating at different objectives. So, you know, I'm not saying everything's perfect. I'm not saying there aren't issues. As I say, in terms of creator remuneration, clearly there are concerns which need to be looked at seriously. But I think we need to be clear on what the problems are that we're trying to address, and what we shouldn't do is undermine this great success story.
It sounds like more dialogue is needed. So we've got 3 minutes left, and that means that you each have only 1 more minute each to talk about you know, what's next on the horizon. Let's start with Alexandre. What's on the horizon in France in terms of you know, audio streaming and well-founded or not so well-founded regulation of same?
Well, I would say that there is some preliminary discussions about a possible quota system for streaming services. Nothing official though, but it's a nonsense given the natural inclination of the streaming market towards the local scene and local performers. Otherwise, and it's not about specifically about audio services, but as everywhere else, there's a kind of frenzy of public consultations on AI and on generative AI in particular. We keep explaining that models shall be transparent and that we are ready to set up a new market on the basis of freely negotiated licenses with tech companies. So there is opportunities everywhere.
Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you for your contributions. So turning to Canada, the CRTC continues to update its Online Streaming Act implementation work plan, and it is a very heavy caseload. There's research on discoverability, consultations on diversity and inclusion. There's a consultation on market dynamics and sustainability, as well as a consultation on audio policy. So it seems that in Canada, now that the regulator has figured out how to get the money, they're now going to go and figure out the industry. So Patrick, what are the next steps for Music Canada vis-a-vis the CRTC, and what are your goals moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, when you say it like that, I'm pretty happy to have the best team in the world working on this, because otherwise I think I'd be doomed. But look, all of that is happening. We'll be participating in it as an honest broker and as the voice of commercial music throughout. We all understand, you know, it's not our members who are being regulated directly, but it is our music that is being regulated sort of secondhand here. And so we continue to play an important role in making sure that people do understand what's going on. Of course, all of this also takes place under the umbrella of the political landscape in Canada as well. And so we'll be keeping an eye towards that and understanding what the future of digital regulation may hold under a different government. And we'll be using our honest broker approach to make sure that everyone understands what we think has gone right here and what we would change.
Thank you, Patrick. And then Graham, I guess you get the last word. What are your priorities? What are the priorities for the streaming companies in Canada?
Well, yeah, so you very helpfully kind of outlined our work plan for the coming year. And I think you framed it really well, but got the money and now work out what to do with it. But we would have argued it would have been better to have worked out how everything works before impose it. But anyway, so we have a lot of work coming up with the CRTC consultations. Patrick's almost right. Obviously, I have the best team in the world to handle all of
Mhm.
these things. And I've got the last word, so there you go.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much to Music Biz Passport. Thank you to Patrick Rogers, Graham Davies, and Alexander Lash for sharing their valuable time and insights with us today. Thank you to the audience for joining us. These kinds of conversations are really critical to further understanding and good policy making and good music making. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day. Nicole, I'll hand it back to you to close this out.
I couldn't have closed it out any better. I think you said it perfectly. So, thank you guys for being here and thank you for sharing your insights. Thanks for all who attended, and look for a schedule for Passport coming up in 2025. And we'll continue these conversations about what's going on around the globe. Thanks all.